All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're all about photography, and you're in luck because we've got uh, a pretty dense source doc you provided, but
Yeah.
luckily we've got expert speaker here to help us make sense of it all.
Yeah. Looks like someone is ready to take their photos to the next level.
Oh, absolutely. And
Yeah.
they want to do it efficiently too, right? The source is all about getting 80% of the results with just 20% of the effort, that good old Pareto principle.
Yeah. The Pareto principle. Always a good one. It's about finding the high impact stuff, the core techniques that'll make the biggest difference.
Exactly. So no more messing around. Let's jump right in and see what we can uncover
Okay.
today. So first up is ISO. I know it has something to do with light sensitivity, right? But I always get a little tripped up on the details.
Okay, think of it like imagine your camera's sensor is like your eyes adjusting to a dark room. Yeah.
Okay, I can see that.
At first you can't see much. So your eyes have to become more sensitive to pick up any available light. And that's kind of what ISO does for your camera sensor.
So like increasing the ISO is kind of like telling my camera to open its eyes wider when it's dark.
Exactly. But here's the thing, just like straining to see in the dark, there's a trade-off, right? The higher you push that ISO, the more sensitive the sensor gets. But you also introduce the risk of noise, those grainy specks that can make your photos look less sharp.
Ah, right, right. The source mentioned a test shoot with a Sony a7R II, and it showed how that noise increases as you crank up the ISO.
Right, and it's interesting because even at higher ISOs, like 3200, the photos were still pretty usable.
Oh yeah, modern cameras are pretty amazing these days.
They really are. Technology is pretty wild.
So let's say I'm shooting a portrait indoors, and there's not a ton of natural light. I could bump up the ISO to compensate, right?
Totally. You'll capture more light for sure and still get a pretty good image. But generally, keeping that ISO as low as possible is best for those really clean, crisp shots.
Gotcha. So bright sunny day, low ISO, move into some shade, maybe bump it up a bit.
Yeah.
Inside for dinner,
Yeah.
crank that ISO up.
Exactly. That's a good rule of thumb.
All right, now on to aperture. This one has always felt a bit mysterious to me.
Aperture, huh? It's all about control, really. Not just how much light comes in, but how you emphasize your subject and the mood you create. And it all comes down to those tiny blades in your lens that open and close.
Oh, right, that's where the f-stop comes in, right? But I gotta be honest, that whole smaller number equals larger opening thing always trips me up.
Yeah, it's definitely counterintuitive. Just remember this. A lower f-stop, like f1.4, that means those blades are wide open, bigger aperture, more light, and that beautiful blurry background you see in portraits.
Ah, okay, so if I want that super dreamy, blurred background look, I should be aiming for a low stop number.
Exactly. That's that shallow depth of field where only your subject is in sharp focus makes them pop.
But if I'm shooting a group photo, I'd want everyone to be sharp, so I'd use a higher f-stop, like f8.
You got it. Higher f-stop, more in focus.
Okay, starting to click for me now. So what about landscapes? When I want everything from the foreground rocks to those distant mountains to be super crisp.
For that, you got to crank that f-stop up, maybe to f16 or even higher. You create this really deep depth of field. Everything's nice and sharp no matter how far away it is.
This is making so much more sense now. Aperture is about way more than just letting in light.
Right. It's about shaping the look of your photo.
All right, now on to the last element in our little trio here, shutter speed. Now I know it's about how long the shutter stays open, but how does that actually affect my photos?
Okay, imagine you're watching a hummingbird flitting between flowers, right? If you only glance at it for a split second, you get this frozen moment, wings sharp, everything still. That's like a fast shutter speed.
So if I'm photographing my crazy dog catching a frisbee, I'd want a fast shutter speed to freeze the action.
You got it. Something like 1500th of a second or faster, and that frisbee will be crystal clear. But if you wanted to show the blur of the movement, give it that sense of energy, you'd slow that shutter speed down.
That's cool. I remember the source mentioned that the photographer actually prefers shutter speeds between 150th and 1500th of a second for portraits, probably to avoid any unwanted blur from like slight movements, right?
Exactly. You want to capture them sharp but not too rigid, right?
Makes sense. So fast shutter freezes action, slow shutter creates blur. Got it.
Yep. But it's more than that. It's all about how these three elements work together, this thing called the exposure triangle.
The exposure triangle.
Oh.
That sounds intriguing. All right, so we've covered the basics, but I have a feeling things are about to get a whole lot more interesting as we explore this exposure triangle you mentioned, right?
Oh, yeah. It's where the magic happens. It's not just about understanding them individually. It's about seeing how they all dance together to create that perfectly exposed photo. That's what we'll dive into next.
Okay, so we've covered ISO, aperture, and shutter speed individually.
Yeah.
But you mentioned this exposure triangle thing, and
Right.
I have a feeling this is where it all comes together,
Yeah.
right?
It is. It's where the magic happens, really. It's not just about understanding those elements on their own. It's about how they all work together, to create a photo that's, well, perfectly exposed.
All right, I'm ready to see this magic in action. Walk me through it.
Okay, imagine you're out shooting a landscape, right? Beautiful sunset, the light is changing fast, got to be quick on your feet. So first, you think about your ISO, light's fading, might need to bump that up a bit to make sure you capture enough detail.
Okay, higher ISO to brighten things up, but doesn't that make the photo, grainy?
It could, yeah, but that's where aperture and shutter speed come in to save the day. You can balance that higher ISO by opening up your aperture a bit, let in more light.
So lower f-stop, right? But wait, wouldn't that make my depth of field shallower, so not everything in the landscape would be in focus?
You're catching on quick. That's the thing. You got to make choices, right?
Oh.
If you want everything tacked sharp from front to back, you might need to sacrifice a bit of light, use a higher f-stop, and then compensate by slowing down that shutter speed.
So it's like a constant balancing act.
Yeah.
You tweak one thing and it affects everything else.
Exactly. It's this dynamic process, right? You're juggling these three elements, ISO, aperture, shutter speed, to get the look you want. And the source really emphasizes that it's about knowing your priorities for each shot.
This is starting to feel less like a formula and more like, I don't know, an art form.
That's a great way to put it.
So you understand the rules, but you also know when to bend them, right?
Exactly. Let's say you're shooting a portrait in a dimly lit cafe. You want that soft, dreamy look, the background all blurry. You'd start with a wide aperture, right, for that shallow depth of field.
Okay, low fluff for the blur. But wouldn't that let in too much light, make the photo too bright?
Could happen. But you can then lower your ISO, make your sensor less sensitive, and then to fine-tune it, you adjust that shutter speed.
So I could use a faster shutter speed to balance out the wider aperture and that lower ISO.
Right.
It's like a puzzle, finding the right combination.
You got it. And that's what's so cool about it. There's no one right answer. It's all about the choices you make. And the source really stresses that it all starts with visualizing the final image you want.
So before I even touch my camera, I need to be thinking about like the mood, the story I'm trying to tell, all that.
Exactly. That vision is your guide, and then the exposure triangle becomes your toolkit to bring it to life. And the source also had some neat tips on like troubleshooting when things go wrong.
Oh, perfect. Because I think we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
Fumbling around with settings, wondering why our photos are coming out too dark or too bright.
For sure. First thing, always check your histogram. That's a little graph that shows you the tones in your photo from dark to light, and it helps you see if you're losing any detail, in those really bright or dark areas.
Okay, that sounds kind of technical. Can you break that down for me?
Sure. Imagine you're taking a photo of like a snowy mountain. If the highlights are clipped, the snow might just look like a white blob, no texture or anything.
I see. So it's like a warning system, making sure you're capturing all the detail in the scene.
You got it. Secret weapon for balanced exposure. Now let's say your photo's too dark. You've got options, right? Slow down that shutter speed, open up the aperture, or bump up the ISO.
But each of those has trade-offs, right? Like we talked about.
Exactly. Slower shutter speed might introduce blur. Wider aperture means less in focus. Higher ISO might make things grainy.
So again, it's about finding that balance. What if the photo's too bright?
Same idea, just the opposite. Faster shutter speed, narrower aperture, lower the ISO, and always remember those trade-offs.
Man, this is so helpful. It's like I have a whole toolbox now to deal with any lighting situation.
That's the power of the exposure triangle. You're making informed decisions, not just randomly fiddling with buttons.
Absolutely. Speaking of, there's this one question I have to ask. This debate that's been raging among photographers forever.
Oh boy, here we go.
I gotta know. Is it ISO or ESO?
Honestly, I've heard both from like really respected photographers, and frankly, I don't think it matters that much.
Really? I always thought there was a right answer.
I think the important thing is that we understand the concept, right? Whether you say ISO or ESO doesn't change what it does.
That's a good point. It's more about the substance, not getting hung up on the words.
Right. It's about the photos.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got these three elements down, this exposure triangle. Feeling pretty confident, but I'm sure there's more to uncover, right?
Yeah, tons more. Yes. This source goes beyond just the technical stuff, too. There's this whole other layer of, like, artistry and vision that we haven't even touched on yet.
Ooh, okay. And I'm guessing that's what we're diving into next.
You bet. We're going to explore some more advanced techniques, stuff that can really elevate your photos to a whole new level. But first, let's take a moment to let all this sink in.
Okay, so we've tackled that exposure triangle, and I feel like we've leveled up already.
Yeah, for sure.
But you mentioned there's more to this source, right? Stuff that goes beyond just the technicals.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This source, it really dives into the art of photography, the stuff that separates a good photo from a great one. And one of the big things they emphasize is composition.
Composition, right. I've heard that's like key, but it always feels a bit, I don't know, overwhelming.
It can be, yeah, but there are some simple techniques that can make a huge difference. One of the most well-known is the rule of thirds. Ever heard of that?
I think so, but remind me.
Okay, so imagine dividing your frame into 9 equal parts, like with 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines. The idea is to position your subject, or the most interesting parts of your scene, along those lines or where they intersect.
So instead of just putting my subject like dead center.
Exactly. Off-center often creates a more dynamic and balanced composition. It just draws your eye through the photo in a more interesting way.
Okay, I can see that. Any other composition tips?
Oh, yeah, tons. The source also talks about leading lines. These are lines in your photo that kind of naturally draw your eye towards the main subject, things like roads, fences, rivers, even the lines of a building.
Oh, I see. So like instead of just taking a random photo of a landscape, I could try to find those natural lines that lead the eye towards something specific.
Exactly, like maybe a distant mountain or a lone tree. It adds depth, a sense of story.
Man, this is great stuff. It's like composition is its own language,
It is. And the source, it dives into lighting too, which is, well, it's everything in photography, really.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely noticed how different the same scene can look depending on the time of day or the weather.
Totally. This source talks about something called the golden hour, which is basically that hour right after sunrise and the hour before sunset. The light's all soft and warm, long shadows, perfect for portraits and landscapes.
Okay, so if I want that, like that warm, magical glow in my photos, I got to shoot during those specific times.
You got it. And if you're stuck shooting midday, when the sun's super harsh, the source says find some open shade. Creates a much nicer, more flattering light.
Golden hour and open shade. Got it. Writing these down. Anything else about lighting?
Yeah, they touched on backlighting too, which is when you have your light source behind your subject. Creates this cool rim of light that outlines them.
Ah, so that's how you get those like ethereal silhouettes where the person's almost glowing.
Exactly. Adds drama, a bit of mystery.
This is really making me see the world in a whole new way.
That's the beauty of photography.
Right.
And this deep dive, it's really giving you the tools to explore that, to take control and really express yourself through your photos.
I feel that. So we've covered a ton. We've got ISO, aperture, shutter speed, that exposure triangle, composition, lighting. I'm feeling pretty confident.
You should. And remember, this is just the start, right? There's always more to learn. But now you have this solid foundation to build on.
I'm excited to keep exploring. So to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this photography deep dive. We hope you're feeling inspired, ready to grab your camera and get out there and shoot.
Absolutely. The best camera is the one you have with you. So go out there, have fun, and capture your world.
And hey, maybe send us some of your photos. We'd love to see what you create. Until next time, happy shooting.